Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening or good morning, wherever you might be on the planet. My name is Rodolfo Dirzo, and I am at Stanford University, together with my colleagues, Chinmay Sonowane and Luisa Jinish, and we are delighted to welcome you all to this workshop webinar. I want to start by saying that this is the second of a series of workshops, the theme of which is reconnecting people and nature. The first one we organized had to do with the connections between biological diversity, food production, food security, and sustainability. And of course, that's a critical way of connecting us, people, with nature. And today we are addressing art and nature, because I think we are all convinced that art is a fantastic, a splendid connector of humans with nature. And I am delighted that we're going to have four persons who are going to tell us about, or who are going to exemplify the beauty of the connections between art and people. Let me start by telling you about a personal experience really very quickly. I was extremely fortunate some years ago to be in northern Spain, in the Cantabrian Spain, where I had a chance to visit the Altamira caves. This is a fantastic set of caves of the Paleolithic, in which the first manifestations, I think, of humanity and art and expressions of art and techniques associated to the production of art are so vividly represented there. If you ever have a chance to visit Altamira, I strongly recommend for you to visit that incredible setting of the connections between humans and nature. And I think that's a wonderful example of how we, our species, was from those times very much inspired and motivated and delighted in expressing art and expressing art with nature. And since those times to now, we have seen multiple manifestations of the connections between art and people, moving from Altamira to now movies, poetry, painting, films. And of course, you might remember very recently this movie, Don't Look Up, connecting problems of nature with humanity as well. So this passion and motivation to connect art with people has been with us for many years in the history of humanity. And I'm delighted that today we have four scholars that are going to present to us four perspectives and views of the connection between art and nature. I'm delighted to have my colleagues, Chinmay and Luisa, to introduce the speakers in 1 second. Before I do that, I want to mention to you that if you have questions that we can save some of those questions for the Q&A session of the event at the end, but there might be opportunities also to ask some questions at the end of the speakers as well. And so without further ado, welcome again, and I pass on the microphone to my colleagues to introduce the first two speakers. So Chinmay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. For our first speaker, we're delighted to welcome Professor Adam Brumm from Griffith University in Queensland, Australia. Adam's research in archaeology has resulted in what are widely considered some of this past decade's biggest breakthroughs, not just in archaeology, but in science broadly. And this is because his research on art by early humans has enriched our understanding of the evolution of human cognition, and particularly the origins of our ability to imagine and to tell stories. So with that, I'll hand it over to Adam to talk more about his work.
Speaker we have today is Jessica Sarah Rinland. Jessica is an Argentine-British filmmaker who has screened internationally in several film festivals and has won several awards, including the Best Film at Documenta Madrid. She holds a BA in Fine Arts from Central St. Martin's in London and a Master's in Arts from the MIT. And she currently teaches at UCL, Harvard Summer School, and Elias Quireta Cine Escola in Spain. And you'll see in her presentation and from the couple of clips that she's going to show that really, unlike other nature documentaries that usually focus on the beauty of nature or the natural world by itself, Jessica's films really showcase how humans really take care of the natural world and the relationships between humans and nature. So without further spoilers, I'm gonna hand it off to Jessica. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luisa. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So, as Luisa mentioned, I'm a filmmaker, and I tend to explore tactile processes of labor within varying disciplines, including conservation, archaeology, zoology, and marine biology. I'll just give a few examples of some films that I've worked on in the past years. This is a film that was made between 2014 and 2018 with the Elmbridge Natural History Society in south of London. It's situated in a common land that is an interesting space. It was occupied in the 17th century by agrarian socialists, the diggers. But what I mostly explore in the film is the current Natural History Society and their involvement in bat and moth trapping, mycology, tree measuring, and botanical walks. And a book was published also last year. I tend to work a lot in book form as well as film. That's kind of explores further the land and the society and my relationship with them. In 2021, I made a film called Sol de Campinas with a group of archaeologists in Acre, Brazil, which traces the work of archaeologists who, for the past 10 years, have been excavating a ring of mounds surrounding a central plaza within Acre, Brazil. And they transition from field to laboratory, interpreting how the land was constructed, what patterns were employed in settlement land use, and the composition of anthropogenic earth that remains. And I'm currently working on a film, have been since 2019, that hopefully will be finished next year, it explores notions of care and captivity in various zoos and rewilding centers in Argentina. But for this talk, I decided that I'm going to go back to a film that I made in 2019, which Luisa was also involved with. And the book form the artist book form is still in process, and I'm going to read part of an essay that I wrote for that. But the project is a multi-layered artwork which culminated in a ceramic replica of an elephant's tusk that's currently housed at London's Natural History Museum, a feature film titled Those That at a Distance Resemble Another. The artwork as a whole deconstructs museological and ecological conservation, inviting reflection upon forms of representation, replicas, and embodiments of various materials, disciplines, and institutions. So I'll start by just showing like the first 5 minutes of the film, which was filmed with Luisa in the Tijuca National Park in Rio, Brazil. And then I'll continue by reading an essay from the project.
Bota parabéns a...
Galera, a Carla tá com filhote, tá? Tá bom?
Só pra
Só pra avisar
deixar
vocês
claro.
que a Carla tá com filhote. A gente tá aqui tremendo. Por acaso tem um sinal aqui na Cova da Onça. Ela está com um filhote.
Parabéns a todos envolvidos. Temos um macaco.
Reintroduction roller coaster é nós. Queen of the Forest. Carla.
Ai, meu Deus, cara. Cara, seguir um trio vai ser coisa de louco. Meu Deus.
That's the best howler monkey, Kala. This female, she's been here like since we released the first group,
Yeah.
and she like survived all by herself for like months until we released this other one, and they bonded together, and now. And she had a baby when she was all by herself, and then she lost her baby, like, and now. I don't know what. Porque eles têm dois às vezes.
Podem?
Não deu pra entender, deu pra ver um rabinho, mas não deu pra ter certeza.
Podem ter dois?
Pode ter dois. Sobrevive dois até.
isso.
Seria bom, a gente tá precisando.
A gente tá precisando demais.
Tengo un amigo que se llama Maximiliano y cuando era pequeño él quería ser un árbol. Entonces agarraba ramitas y se colocaba en el medio del jardín con las manos al aire y se quedaba quieto. Y lo que quería hacer era que confundieran al pájaro y creyera que él fuera un árbol para que él pudiera tuviera un pajarito. It didn't last long. I mean, la paciente de 5 años eran como que 3 segundos, 4 segundos. Nunca agarró nunca nada.
¿Qué pajarito sí se confundió? ¿Qué pensaba que le dieron nada?
No, pero él hacía bien, se vestía verde y todo. A mí había una lógica, pero no había necesidad de poder ser.
Just going to reshare the screen because I realized that I didn't do it with sound. My mother, Analia, keeps each item of clothing individually wrapped in her cabinet. Some are in old dry cleaning bags, other in bags the clothes came in, or in reused plastic bags. When you compliment her outfit, she doesn't say thank you. She says, oh, it's old, and tells you where she bought it 30 years ago in Argentina with her mother before immigrating to England. She's generally a very clean and organized person. She's been told on numerous occasions that her house is like a museum. Everything is looked after and impeccable. Even the objects that are not kept in plastic bags are regularly dusted and polished. Each object is placed on a surface, a table or a wall deliberately, as if being allowed the space to breathe. She's been collecting small boxes for as long as I have known her. Her favorites are empty, laid out on a particular fingerprintless glass top table. In his book, The Predicament of Culture, James Clifford wrote, quote, whether a child collects model dinosaurs or dolls, sooner or later they will be encouraged to keep the possessions on a shelf or in a special box, or to set up a doll's house. Personal treasures will be made public. My mother is actively exhibiting, caring not only for each object, but also how visitors experience her home. Of course, her home is private. Those who enter have been invited in. Her garden is similar to the interior of the house. The colors of each plant are chosen and arranged in specific locations, trimmed regularly, with weeds consistently removed from the root. In England, there's a tradition dating back to 1959 called the National Gardeners Scheme, where people choose to open up their private home gardens to the public once a year. Similarly, within public museums, there are occasional open days and guided tours to selected private and restricted areas, such as archive collections and storage spaces not readily available to the public. Otherwise, access to a particular part of a museum or to view a specific object often involves a long and arduous process with multiple forms and delays. For the past Within museum archives, objects are stored under specific conservation regulations. In the MAE, the Museo de Arqueología y Etnología of Sao Paulo, the artifacts are wrapped in plastic bags and kept in temperature-controlled environments for conservation purposes. Conservation seems to be a human necessity, a need to preserve a culture or a memory, verbally or through objects. Although conservation as a practice within museums began during the 19th century, humans have been conserving art since prehistory. Traditional storyteller of the Nagul Wara clan, Willie Gordon, when talking about the preservation of indigenous rock art, said, quote, if you go to different parts of Australia, the tribes have already recoated and repainted art. They've painted it because it's our culture to keep it. They've repainted it because it's our culture to keep it alive and well. This is when I was a child, when Analia took me to the Zoológico de Buenos Aires. The zoo was conceived in 1875 by Argentine President Domingo Sarmiento. The first director of the zoo, Eduardo Holmberg, structured the environment so that the animals would be housed in buildings that reflected their countries of origin. For example, a replica of a Hindu temple was built for Asian elephants, housing the first one to ever be born in a zoo. These replicas were built as an attempt to conserve the imagined original home of the elephants. The idea of a lived human architecture being built for an elephant so that she can feel more at home is absurd. There is scenography that allow the public to imagine a fiction of animals living in human-built environments from their home countries. But paradoxically, the real power of these replicas is that they highlight the fact that animals were extracted from varying countries for exhibition.
thin plates that keep separate. They're very slippery. Piece in there. All this.
My friend Todd Salt worked as a technician building displays at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. In the staff canteen, he had overheard a colleague of his, Nigel Bamforth, discussing a cabinet filled with ivory in the furniture conservation lab. Nigel had previously worked in the fashion industry with a subsequent 22 years and 4 months heading the furniture conservation department at the V&A. I visited him in April 2016, where he generously showed me the cabinet filled with ivory, which he explained was used for furniture and artifact conservation, primarily to replicate broken parts. He said that the material had been donated by customs. I was curious whether the use of confiscated ivory in artifact conservation and restoration occurred in other national museums, while staff at the British Museum mentioned that they also held ivory for similar use. The official response I received by email from the head of conservation at the time was, quote, "No Western trained conservator would use plant or animal material for object conservation, as it is neither ethical nor useful to do." I visited Nigel again in March 2017 and asked him why alternative materials were not used instead. He answered, quote, "We have the material ivory available to us, so it would be rather pointless. Alternatives that exist for ivory include celluloid and the jardina seed, also known as vegetable ivory, a dried endosperm of the seed Phytelephus from the Amazon." That's the seed. In 1997, European Commission Council Regulation 338/97 was passed, making illegal the trade of any worked ivory acquired later than 3rd of March 1947. A worked specimen are those that are significantly altered from their natural raw state, for example, jewelry, adornment, art, utility, or musical instruments. After much criticism and significant appeals aimed to create a total ban, the United Kingdom government published the Ivory Bill in May 2018, indicating a total ban on ivory sales, with some exceptions, including allowing the continued sale of ivory to museums and between museums. There is no specific reference in this bill or in any previous regulation about the donation or sale of confiscated ivory from HM Customs and Excise to museums. Nigel mentioned the bureaucracy of loaning objects or artifacts overseas, which include materials of endangered species. The process includes completing a Conservation of International Trade in Endangered Species CITES form, having to name the species, where the animal came from, the previous owner of the piece, and when it was made. In theory, any addition of the contemporary ivory would have been documented by the conservator in the museum's treatment records. Ivory is only a fragment of what is available for Nigel to use in conserving furniture at the V&A. The cabinet also includes bones, turtle shell, rhino horn, ebony, mother of pearl, as well as ivory from elephants, narwhal, and mammoth. The ivory pieces exist in their raw, uncut form, but also worked into tourist art, with images of elephants and faces of diverse African features. Nigel's consciousness towards elephant endangerment comes to the forefront when interacting with these carved works, saying how horrible it is that they slaughter the poor sods for something so diabolical, these rubbish, hideous carvings, not even 18th century beautiful carvings like before. The furniture which Nigel is conserving, as well as other objects in museum collections across the world, are imbued with a certain privilege. Not only is the object saved, but its history, the culture it emulates or represents, is conserved, even if it is not the maker's intent. While in Belém, the state of Pará, Brazil, at the Museu Paranense Emílio Belgi, I came across the practice of making replicas as a form of conservation. An hour north of Belém, in the district of Iguaracy, most inhabitants have worked as ceramicists for centuries. In the 1990s, there was an upsurge of ceramic making after they had come across photographs of ceramic from both the local Marajoara Island and European pottery. The photographs usually only showed one side of the object and did not include measurements. Therefore, the ceramic copies were representative of one angle, but not the whole. In May 2017, archaeologists Elena Lima and Cristina Vereto started a program at the museum that invited ceramicists from Iguaracy into the archive to select works to replicate. They produced 2 reproductions, one for the museum for educational purposes, and another was kept by the ceramicists to sell as accurate, more costly replicas. When the replica artist or conservator is in close proximity interacting with the object they are copying, they enter a process of embodiment, becoming for that moment a manifestation of the artist. Plaster is a standard material used for producing museum replicas with a technique of casting that allows a replica to be economical and easily reproducible. But using the original higher quality, more costly material of, in this case, clay, and by making each object individually by eye, these replicas are closer to the original both in the process of making and in their materiality. Another example of the conservator embodying the artist is through the writing of technical papers at Harvard Art Museum's Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies. Conservators scrutinize an object by both looking with different technologies and physically mimicking the material process to understand how the artist created the work. From this, they write incredibly detailed reports outlining their research and their conclusions on how best to conserve the object. For instance, the conservator describes what part of the finger was used by the artist to build the clay away or towards them. At the MAE, archaeologist Adenja Oliveira studies diverse patterns of Amazonian funerary urns by physically tracing the markings. Wearing latex gloves to protect the ceramic from her fingertips, she wraps several layers of cling film carefully around the urn to delicately trace the details. She then lays out cling film, and together with precise measurements she has taken from the urn, she draws them out. She has chosen to use her hands, cling film, and measuring tape as tools to learn rather than more advanced technologies. From conversations with her, it's clear that it is integral for her to feel a spiritual closeness to the artist or maker when she is working with such a powerful object which once held human remains. Here again, Arangeda is embodying the artist. Although she is not a conservator, the work of an archaeologist undergoing these practices could be seen as forming part of a highly collaborative and interdisciplinary process of conservation. Non-human agents also play an important collaborative role in conserving archaeological artifacts, including the worm. Charles Darwin notes that, quote, archaeologists are probably not aware of how much they owe to worms for the preservation of many ancient objects. Archaeology is still a subject that is actually carried out in the realm of earthworms. Their burrows and galleries form and reform the matrix surrounding the harder materials from which we deduce whole cultures. Usually, conversations and collaborations between conservator, art historian, and scientist are the first stage in deciding what, if anything, should be done to the object. If relevant, archaeologists and curators are also involved. Recently, there's been an introduction of non-human agents such as bacteria as participants in the collaborative process of conserving. Typically understood as playing a role in the biodegradation process of natural history specimens, conservator Lorraine Cornish and her team at the Natural History Museum in London carefully and rigorously cleaned away the dust from a blue whale skeleton that had accumulated while being housed in the mammal section of the museum since the 1930s, before being moved into a new exhibition space in the main museum entrance, Hinsey Hall. Whale bones accumulate more dust than other specimens due to the fact that they continue emitting oil in their exhibited state. Samples of the structure and composition of the dust were taken, as well as DNA extraction and sequencing to help identify the microbial species, which microbial species had been living on the specimen and their relative abundance. Although the final decision was taken to rid the skeleton entirely of dust, there was some hesitation as there may have been some positive aspects to it being there. The dust particles may have been holding cracked parts of the bone together. In Grace Kim's paper titled Putting Microbes to Work, she mentions that in recent studies, microbiologist Giancarlo Caligaris argues that particular kinds of microbes can be used to repair objects of cultural heritage in a process called biorestoration. In the case of Lina Arpesani's 1921 funerary monument, Nera, microbiologists used bacteria to remove a sulfate-based black crust caused by pollution to reveal the original marble. They applied the bacterium I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but it's Desulfobrio, who have the ability to discriminate between materials. This multi-species collaboration could be an interesting method to introduce it to ethnographic museums. For Indigenous communities who choose to allow their ancestral subjects to live within museums, this multi-species collaboration could be a progressive move towards museums working with subjects that have been made with the intent of interacting with organisms.
Bien, pero cuando estaba escribiendo también, yo creía que esto se estaba metiendo. Era tu cabeza, así no está nada.
Thank you. Sorry about the screen at the beginning.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We really appreciate the diversity of art forms that you've introduced us to. I think in the interest of time, we might leave some of the questions that you received towards the end. But next, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Kelly Chappell from the biology department here at Stanford. Kelly has been an inspiration to many, certainly many in the department here and in our lab, not just because of her phenomenal research on how species interact with each other, but also because of the many achievements that she's had in improving access to STEM fields for underrepresented communities. And Kelly's invested a monstrous amount of time and effort in leading a program called BioJam. So I'll hand it over to her to tell you much more about it.
Thank you so much, Chinmay. I'm really honored to be here today. And I wouldn't say that I'm leading BioJam. I'm actually representing the BioJam Collective here today. So let's get into it. As Chinmay shared, my name is Kelly Chappell, and I recently finished my PhD in the Department of Biology, where I'm currently a lecturer, but I'm also an incoming innovation fellow at Stanford Center for International Security, Cooperation, CSAC, and also a professional bioartist and educator. But as I mentioned, I won't be actually presenting on my own work today, but will instead be sharing the work of a group, BioJam. BioJam is a political, educational, and artistic collective that focuses on advancing social and environmental justice through the intersection of science and art. So I want to start out by asking you a question. When I say bioengineering, what do you think of? Maybe it's stuff like this, these AI-generated images. You might think of synthetic cells or creating synthetic organisms, recoding life, stuff that people made. And in some ways, bioengineering is sometimes seen as the antithesis of the intersection between people and nature, with nature being sequestered away in these sterile scientific labs with quote unquote objective scientists trying to design optimal organisms for our own machinations. And it's that framing of the intersection of the lack of the intersection between people and nature that makes it so perplexing when there's tons of headlines asking whether synthetic biology and bioengineering can address the climate crisis. Yet the people who develop the technology and the questions that we ask and the way we go about creating technology must acknowledge who is included and who is excluded, how nature and the values embedded in those might get ignored in the production of technology, and that social and environmental justice matters in biotechnology design. So my talk today will ask 3 questions. Who leads the way in biotechnology design? What can biotechnology be? And how can we use biotechnology to change systems of oppression? So thinking forward, thinking into the future, and imagining what biotechnology can be, these are some ideas that I had. Imagining a solar punk future with Mexican-American agricultural workers living in a bioutopia in the Salinas Valley of the United States. And in fact, the talk that I'm going to tell you about today and the work that we're doing is working towards this type of utopia. And imagining biotechnology and bioengineering centered around the relationship between people and nature. So today I want to show you how, by putting people and nature together, we're able to address key environmental justice issues in the Anthropocene. And I'm going to be telling you a story about BioJam Camp, which is a 3-week summer camp for high school students that celebrates this intersection between art, science, and culture. And I want to start out with a little bit of a metaphor in the form of a biological example. So in North America, many groups have grown the milpa, which is sometimes referred to as the 3 sisters, which is this combination of a tall growing plant like corn growing alongside a nitrogen fixing legume like beans and a ground living squash species such as pumpkins. And this polyculture approach isn't just an agricultural practice for increasing yields and providing a healthy diet, but also serves as an agro-ecosystem where milpa can be a refugia for insects, and they can also serve as carbon sinks. MILPA is not just a biological phenomenon, but also a cultural one that represents deep cultural heritages with a variety of ceremonies and rituals associated with it, and repeatedly are part of different groups, particularly BIPOC groups in North America and Central America, stories of survival. And so in some ways, the MILPA actually epitomizes, in my view, this intersection of people and nature as biotechnology. If we consider things like MILPA, ancestral, current, and future technology as biotechnology, perhaps it can expand what we consider biotechnology to be. We can think of biotechnology as ancestral knowledge, as community, as culture, and as interspecies collaboration. In some ways, the MILPA actually represents BioJam Camp very well, where we actually work in collaboration with youth, with community, and different systems of knowledge to expand what we consider biotechnology innovation to be. So we see BioJam as a political entity that's centered in community. It's a summer camp that amplifies youth voices, and it's also a form of science activism that celebrates alternative systems of knowledge in science. So in this talk, I'm going to share a little bit about BioJam's mission and vision, the history of our program, an overview of our camp and some of the activities, how we've shared out our work into broader community spaces, and how we do it through our organizational structure. So just getting started with our mission and vision, our vision has always been to nurture teen or youth knowledge, confidence, and curiosity as they grow into science practitioners and educators, really expanding what teens imagine science to be. Also to provide a research and training opportunity for scientists to work humbly, to work with humility with teens and non-science community members to reimagine what they imagine science to be. And finally, to create accessible entry points for community engagement in biotechnology. And in fact, having the communities having what we might consider to be non-historically scientific communities to actually be the leaders and the innovators in the future of biotechnology design. And our mission is to engage these teens through their own creativity and culture, for example, through art in bioengineering, and creating pathways for them to share their learning back with their home communities. So how do we go about doing this, and where did it all start? It actually started in 2019, in a Uber ride or a rideshare ride between Rolando Perez, a bioengineering PhD student at Stanford who finished wonderfully and is now doing many great things, and Corinne Okada Takara, a community educator and bioartist. And they were at a conference, they happened to get in the same rideshare, and they started talking about how there needs to be more spaces that celebrate culture, community, and art in conversations about biotechnology design. And they hacked together a camp along with some other compatriots in the Stanford's Department of Bioengineering in order to have a very first in-person camp in 2019. I came on board. I was graciously invited by Rolando to join the BioJam team in 2020, shortly before the pandemic hit. And so we pivoted to having a remote camp this year that focused on biotechnology for addressing pandemics. And in 2021, we started a hybrid camp. Now, the past 2 years, we've actually expanded to having in-person camps that's run by a very large team that I'll tell you about later. It's a mixture of teens, of community educators, of advisory board members, and Stanford volunteers. Let me tell you a little bit about our teens. So when we first started BioJam, we actually had teens from all over the greater Bay Area of California. You can see here's California, and zooming in on the Bay Area, we had teens from Oakland, from East San Jose, and as well as from Salinas. But in the past couple of years, through a collaboration with the Monterey County Office of Education, Region 16 Migrant Ed program, we've actually focused in on just serving migrant teens. And so for the past 2 years, we've served about 30 migrant teens, as well as teen mentors. So these are former BioJam participants who come back and are leaders and mentors for our camp. And you can see here's a couple of them here. And those are our team participants in our program. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of our camp and some examples of curriculum items. So our program focuses on highlighting teens' cultural knowledge, creativity, and identity as bioengineering in kind of a two-part system. The first part is where the teens co-learn with adult participants. And so we ask the teens what they know about, we share what we know about, and we have conversations through a lot of hands-on activities that really amplify the knowledge that both of us bring to the table, and celebrate the fact that everyone has something to share and everyone has something to learn. And after doing co-learning, so usually it's a couple of weeks, we have the teens culminate in designing their own activities to share back what they've learned and also what they've taught us to community using hands-on workshop activities. So I'm going to give you an example focusing on Chinampas. So Chinampas are a Mesoamerican system of agriculture that's similar to aquaponics, what we consider to be aquaponic systems. And what's really amazing about these Chinampas or these floating gardens is they focus on this holistic approach to sustainable food production. So there are these floating gardens that have usually fish living down below, and they have a variety of permaculture, so a lot of different plants growing on these floating islands. And the teens actually made their own DIY Chinampas. So you can see here's Ilda with her Chinampa here in a jar. I'm going to show you a TikTok of them making the Chinampa.
We can chase waterfalls and talk till all my hair dries. Just lie on the sand, each hand in hand in paradise. 'Cause we don't go on till we say so long.
Those are TikToks. So I'm going to actually show you a bunch of TikToks of our activities because I'm like, this is the most fun way. These are TikToks that the teens themselves have actually made for our TikTok account. I'll show you our socials later. But that was a clip from our camp last year where the teens were washing a bunch of plants that were actually donated by community members to support our program and making these hands-on Chinampa in a jar. We have plants, edible plants growing on top, and we have fish or snails living below in the circular system. And we have conversations about environmental justice and how, for example, using circular forms of agriculture more sustainable to avoid overuse of fertilizers, for example, that have really strong health effects, environmental justice impacts in their own communities, and how their own cultural knowledge can be well springs of innovation and forward-looking. Ancestral knowledge can actually lead to forward-looking innovations that they can be the leaders of in their own communities. I'm also going to show you this as another activity where we had the students make these sun prints or cyanotypes, thinking about their identity and their own relationship with plants. So how their knowledge, their experience of land ties into their experience of working and knowing plants. Many of these migrant youth or their families work in agriculture in a variety of ways, but mostly as field workers. And so this was an example of an art activity that sparked conversation about identity and connection to land. Another TikTok made by teens.
What's this?
It's an art project.
Okay, I like it. Picasso.
So funny. I don't know anything about TikTok, so they were like taking my phone, making the TikToks, and I think they're really fun. So we don't need to watch it again. I'm going to go to the next page. Here's an activity where we talked about our connection with land being tied to circuitry and the movement of ions and how we think about, for example, ecosystem ecology. And we tied that through to making circuits and the fact that all of us are, or all living things are conductive, and we can actually make circuits with our bodies. So the teens were really excited about playing games with these biocircuits and having conversations about our connection with land. So after these fun co-learning activities, the teens share out. And I'm going to give you 3 different examples of how the teens have shared out their work associated with the camp and some more later. And so one of them was actually coming to Stanford and the teens being knowledge holders and teachers for Stanford scientists. So we had this really cool hands-on workshop where they were actually teaching about hydroponics to do hands-on activities with Stanford scientists, some of which are shown here. And with the teens being the teens being the teachers and the scientists at Stanford being the learners. So here's a little TikTok that they made of first their campus visits. We did a fun overnight campus visit, and then I'm going to show you the TikTok of them presenting.
Dans mon esprit tout divague, je me perds dans tes yeux, je me noie dans la vague de ton regard amoureux. Je ne veux que ton âme divagant sur ma peau, une fleur, une femme dans ton cœur, Roméo. Je ne suis que ton ombre, le souffle lancinant de nos corps dans le sombre, animé lentement. Et la nuit, je pleure des larmes qui coulent le long de mes joues. Je ne pense dans
And here's the TikTok of them presenting.
É tão gostoso quando eu
This is really fun. Another way they shared out was they actually did workshops at elementary schools with other migrant youth. So elementary school students, little students, they came and did the same workshop that they did at Stanford for younger kids so they could learn also. And that is really focused on the teens being leaders within their own community. And even regionally, they've taught workshops at, for example, this was at the Exploratorium, a science museum in San Francisco, where they taught this mini root ecosystem activity where they created these, in a Tic Tac containers, hydrogel beads where plants could root, and they would look at the relationship between nutrient cycling and kind of traditional forms of fertilizers, for example, different caldos with like bananas and with eggs, and how that can be used to promote sustainable agriculture. So these are some examples of how we share out through workshops like I've shared. We've also done workshops at the Tech Interactive Museum, local urban gardeners in Salinas, the Exploratorium, the Lawrence Hall of Science. We've also presented through conferences and some writing pieces. So I'm just going to give you a little taste of that. We've presented at a variety of conferences, but I'm going to focus in on one, the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology, or SICB, where the teens actually not only gave a talk, but actually taught a workshop. So they grew a bunch of biomaterials. These are SCOBY biomaterials. So if you've ever drunk kombucha, the kombucha is made from the symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, and you can dry it down. And it creates this really beautiful kind of leather-like material. And so they wanted, the teens wanted to share out about how one huge environmental justice concern is the production of textiles, and how we can actually make more sustainable textiles by using biomaterials. So they created these really cool silhouettes, and then we mailed 50 kits all over the world with the biomaterials that they grew in their own garages, and had participants design their own costumes for their silhouette creatures and talk about sustainability. They've also done some amazing writings. They've published in Ginkgo Bioworks Grow magazine with their reflections about the pandemic. We've also written a paper for Culture Squared, where we co-wrote with all the teens through visioning, through intergenerational mentorship and writing, and finally a final published manuscript. You can look at the preprint here. And we also have a published paper in the Science Policy Journal, Issues in Science and Technology, where we had a series of listening sessions with the editorial staff. We wrote a piece, we recorded podcasts, and created oral histories that you can listen to at this QR code. And we have a final paper that's published there. So these are ways that we share out to a variety of communities that are not just local to the Greater Bay Area. Now, the last thing I want to emphasize is how BioJam is organized. We have a very unusual structure that focuses on centering power in communities. Oftentimes, academics, the knowledge sharing goes one way. Either academics are sharing as experts to non-academic communities, or communities are providing knowledge to academics that don't necessarily go back into communities. So we wanted to create an organizational structure for BioJam that really center the power in communities and let them take the leading role in what they want, and for academics to really play a learning and a support role. And so to do that, we actually have 4 main branches. The most important is the youth. So we have our teen participants and campers, we have our teen mentors, and we have the curriculum. It's mostly designed by community educators. So we have paid community educators that are activists, that are families and elders, that are artists. We work very closely with the Shinapa Community Biolab in Salinas, and as I mentioned before, the Migrant Ed Region 16 program. And they helped design the curriculum that's supported by a volunteer student organization at Stanford, BioJam Collabs, that's made of undergraduates, graduate students, and staff. And is guided by 3 different advisory boards: a teen advisory board of former participants, a community advisory board of community members and academics. So I'm just going to show you a couple of faces here, not everyone, but our amazing team of community educators, just a small subset of our advisory board members that include a variety of academics, including Rodolfo, who's helping host this seminar today, in education, environmental justice, people who work in museums, activists, informal educators, a variety of people that are really amazing, as well as volunteers from Stanford that include graduate students, undergraduate students, and staff. And our design process looks something like this. Our teams identify camp themes that they want the camp to focus on for the next year. And these paid community educators help develop the curriculum with support from Stanford volunteers. We get logistical support from the Migrant Ed program. We get guidance from our community and advisory board members, and our teen mentors prototype the curriculum and also give feedback. This culminates in our camp, where we have field trips, hands-on activities, campus visits, community workshops. And after the teens participate in camp, they can come back and help identify the camp themes, and they can work and get paid as teen mentors. Something that's really important is everyone except for our Camp Stanford volunteers and our advisory board members are paid. So our educators are paid, our teens get a stipend, as well as our teen mentors, to make sure that people are compensated for their time and expertise. So this leads us to our final question and our first question: what is the future of bioengineering? And what I wanted to share with you today is that BioJam is trying to change who leads the way in conversations about bioengineering, reimagines what bioengineering and biotechnology can be, and create systems change. And so to each of these points, I wanted to share a beautiful quote from Isabella, who is a teen participant in 2020 and teen mentor as well. That her version for the future of bioengineering is having people from diverse backgrounds that create boundaries on gene editing, like Latinos, Asians, African Americans, Native Americans, Indigenous people, people from all over the world, young people, old people, people from hotter climates, people that live from colder climates, scientists, teachers, people like you who care about the environment. That this is the world that she wants to see, that she wants to inherit when she grows older, and what future generations deserve. We want to celebrate biotechnology as not something that's cold and in the lab, but is centered in art, culture, our past, and our future. And that we can create systems change towards social and environmental justice through reimagining who asks the questions and who answers them. And so these are just some amazing images of Chinampas and Milpa in an imaginary utopian world growing in the Salinas Valley of the United States, creating systems change in agriculture to supporting social and environmental justice locally. So thank you so much. Today I've shared a story with you about how blending art and science at BioJam Camp can advance equity in biotechnology design, and in celebrating the combination of both people and nature is actually necessary for supporting environmental justice in the Anthropocene. Thank you so much for your attention today, and please consider following BioJam Camp on Twitter, on Instagram, and TikTok. And this will also take you to our website, as well as more links to information about us. So thank you so much. And if there's time for questions, that's great. And if not, I am happy to get back to people later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for this wonderful presentation on all of the amazing work you do on top of all of your amazing research. Unfortunately, on the interest of time, we're gonna leave questions for the end. So now I'm gonna introduce our next speaker, our last speaker for today, Iris Monteiro Sobrevilla. Iris is a cultural historian of early modern science, working on European, Latin American, and indigenous traditions of natural knowledge production. She got her PhD from University of Cambridge, and she's now an assistant professor of Hispanic Studies at Brown University. And her work has been supported by the Mexican Council of Science and Technology, the Brookman Foundation, the Gates Cambridge Trust, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And I'm really excited to hear about their work on hummingbirds now. I think you're still muted.
Okay. Thank you so much for this lovely invitation. It's been such a treat to listen to Adam, Jessica, and Kelly. I've been so inspired tonight. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak to Rodolfo's lab and team. So let me take you to Mexico City. As you can see, Mexico City today, and this is an image from Google Earth, is located in a valley. You can see all around the urban mass, this green mountain masses, the Parque Nacional Iztaccíhuatl and Popocatépetl, a couple of volcanoes, one of which is currently active. And in general, you get a sense of the type of geography that the Valley of Mexico has today. Back in the 16th century, however, what we now know as Mexico City was much smaller, and it was a hybrid environment. It was an aquatic place. This map from 1524, a map published with the second letter of Hernán Cortés, gives us a very clear idea of how the city of Tenochtitlan looked. We have it at the center of a lake connected to the mainland through various causeways. We have a very large and detailed ceremonial center at the core of the image. And it is here where I would like to draw your attention to. In particular, I would like to draw your attention to this little square that is in the corner of the ceremonial center. It is labeled Domus Animalium, or House of Animals, in Cortés's letter. And from various descriptions from the 16th century, we know that in this particular house, Moctezuma de Tlatoani of Mexico City used to keep a huge variety of animals and birds, teams specialized in keeping them and feeding them, and a whole team of specialized experts in each of these animals. We also know that next to this house of animals, there was another house that lodged specialists in manufacturing luxury goods. There we had the lapidarians, the stonecutters, the feather makers, the people who knew how to work with metals, and they shared this space with the house of animals. Reading these descriptions to me was a really important starting point in my research on hummingbirds and in the place that hummingbirds held in 16th century Mexico and the Mesoamerican world, because it became evident to me that there was a very strong relationship between animals, both as entities that inspired through their behavior the deification of nature, and also through their own bodies, their bodies used as raw materials for the creation of deities. And this happened in these types of places, the House of Birds combined with the House of the Craftspeople. Here is one of the starting points for my research on hummingbirds. When I came across this particular idol of Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god, the image you see on your left from different angles, it became evident that this was a very special object designed almost to size. It's a very tiny jade figurine that is now housed at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris. It's 6.7 centimeters long. It's the actual size of a hummingbird. And it really made me remember some images of hummingbird representations that I had seen in various different documents, and in particular, this one that was included in the document that I will be talking about for most of my intervention. These two things, again, coming back to the idea that the Totocalli, or the House of Animals, the Domus Animalium, was next to the house where the craftspeople lived, really bring to the fore how these two worlds are intersecting in the space of Mexico Tenochtitlan, pre-Columbian Mexico Tenochtitlan. These two can be interpreted in many ways as incarnations of the divinity that are happening both in stone and in paper. And they really bring forward the idea that in this particular world, nature is not something separated for humans at all. It is the fountain, the source of many of the key ideas that regulated life in Mesoamerica, and in particularly in central Mexico. We people who study pre-Columbian Mexico and in colonial Mexico are lucky because we have a huge assortment of sources to study or to work with. Here I'm showing you 3 of the 8 painted histories that we have of the Mexica people, the Nahua-speaking people that established themselves in central Mexico. And these are versions of their own idea of their history. They think of themselves as migrating people, come from a land that hasn't been entirely located. There are many theories, but the most likely theory is that it's somewhere in the American Northwest. And these painted histories basically show the different stations of the Mexica as they moved through space and time in very rich detail. In all of these histories that we have, Huitzilopochtli is often represented as a hummingbird, and here you have 3 examples from 3 different painted histories. On the left, from the Codex Boturini or Tira de la Peregrinación, that is now located in Mexico in the Museo de Antropología, you have him as a kind of humanoid figure with hummingbird headdress, emerging from a pyramid, emerging from a temple, and that is a usual way in which we see represented in this codex. In the second one, the Codex Mexicanus at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, you see it literally as a hummingbird that is being, kind of guiding, starting to guide the people along the way in the beginning of the peregrination. And then lastly, in the Codex Azcatitlan, also at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, you see it attired as a warrior. This is probably the most common idea that we have of this god. Huitzilopochtli is understood mostly as a war god, as a solar god, as a god that was important in inspiring people to wage war. And let's remember the Mexica were a bellicose people. And so this is probably the most common idea that we have of the god. So the god is present as a hummingbird in an assortment of sources. But in spite of this, there had been a void in the historiography about Huitzilopochtli that really didn't include his hummingbird characteristics. And this was one of the questions that I have tried to solve in my own research. To give you just one of the most important testimonies about this, I refer to the words of Edward Seller, a pioneer ethnologist and anthropologist that a century ago to this year wrote that there was not much to say about the hummingbird nature of the god Huitzilopochtli because the sources did not divulge what the lovely, tender bird had to do with a terrible god of war. Here, Seller in some ways revealed one of the key biases, I think, that scholars have had with regards to connecting the hummingbird and Huitzilopochtli, which is that they think of the hummingbird from the outside. They think of the hummingbird from Europe as a polite creature, first and foremost, as a beautiful animal, tiny, fleeting, ethereal, that is rarely seen, is almost never seen, cannot be seen in situ in Europe. But when we look at the animal from the Americas, as most of us are very lucky to do, especially you in California, we know that this animal behaves in many different ways that don't at all relate to the ways it was perceived from the cabinets of curiosities or just from specimens that arrived in Europe. And so we know that these creatures are voracious. We know that they have a tremendous metabolism, the fastest among hot-blooded animals. We know that they can fly in any direction. We also know that they are long-haul migrants. And these 2 species in particular can travel long distances. The rufous hummingbird can go from southern Alaska to central Mexico, and the ruby-throated hummingbird can cross the Gulf of Mexico in one go. So these creatures are really exceptional in many ways. And from my work, it has been evident to me that these characteristics of the hummingbird were evident to indigenous naturalists, indigenous intellectuals in pre-Columbian Mexico. And it was precisely these characteristics that were encoded as part of Huitzilopochtli as a deity. How did I start this journey of reconnection? Well, I wanted to find where I could learn about hummingbirds in the sources that survive. I already showed you the painted histories in the Mexica tradition, in the indigenous tradition. But the source that really made a difference for me was the so-called Florentine Codex. It's an encyclopedic work that was produced between 1559 and 1577 in the context of a Franciscan missionary school in central Mexico, with the collaboration of various generations of indigenous intellectuals. This text, because of its scope, has been labeled the Mexican Encyclopedia. It's a work that has been inspired on Pliny's Naturalis Historia, the Roman naturalist that became so central in Renaissance natural history. So the structure of the Florentine Codex more or less follows Pliny's Historia Naturalis. It is composed of 12 books, and the book that is devoted to nature is book 11, called Natural Things. The first 2 or 3 books have to do with divinities, the gods, the feasts, and the origins of the gods. And interestingly, in none of these books related to the divine and to the ritual world do we find Huitzilopochtli represented as a hummingbird god at all. We will try to analyze why that happens. The Florentine Codex has, as I mentioned, clear European influences, above all Pliny, but it also has a very strong indigenous imprint. It has 2 columns, a column in Nahuatl, a column in Spanish, but mostly it has a very rich visual register that, as I have argued in publication, is strongly related to the Mexica painted histories that I have shown you. Scholars like Diana Magaloni Kerpel have even argued that through the process of bringing into being ancient ways of making, ancient ways of painting the sacred books of the Mexica onto the context of the Florentine Codex, the connection between matter and meaning in these previous works is also present in the Florentine Codex, something that she has been able to prove through chemical analysis of the codex, where we see a very clear correspondence between what is being represented and the materials with which it is represented, the types of pigments. This is a work that involved various generations of people who just very briefly want to show you how it looked at different stages, at different drafts that we have of the Florentine Codex as time passed by between the 1559 and the last version that we know as the Florentine Codex, which looks pretty much like this. Here you see on the right side of each page, the column in Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica. On the left, you see a column in Spanish, and this distinction is interesting to make. This is not a clear, transparent translation of the Nahua column. In fact, there are many absences, there are many changes, adaptations, or just simply entire passages or even entire chapters that are not translated into Spanish for various reasons. This is an area of research on the Codex that has many people still involved. And then we have a visual register. So in book 11, in the natural history, most of the images look like this. They look like tiny illustrations, like vignettes, that inform the text or that show us what kind of animal is being talked about. So, you know, it's clear that the Tlacuilos, the artists or painters of the Florentine Codex, are trying to give us a visual image of what is being described textually. This is another page with a few other examples. Again, always portraying only one creature in a very beautiful and I think artistically creative way, but really mostly illustrating the text. However, I would like to call your attention to this page, which is a page that portrays hummingbirds. They're on the bottom right of your screen. This would seem like a very different image. This is a scene. This is a scene where things are happening. We are not dealing with one particular animal functioning as a little vignette. Here we're seeing a scene with different creatures in different positions, illustrating different behaviors, and as I have argued, portraying a kind of passage of time. We will come back to that. When I first saw that image, I thought, okay, there's something interesting going on here. Why is the hummingbird being portrayed differently? And it became clear through a deeper analysis of the codex that the hummingbird indeed had a very relevant place in terms of the Nahua imaginary. It became a marker of things, an indexer, a category that would help, that was useful to understand the rest of the natural world. Examples like this make that very clear. For example, this is a Huitzilopochtli, literally the hummingbird fish, which we could probably associate with a swordfish. And here the connection is clear. It's the shape of the beak of the hummingbird that somehow becomes a referent to name a similar structure, which would be the sword of the swordfish. Something similar happens with the Huitzilopochtli or opal, and with various other stones or gems that are somehow iridescent, because that iridescence in the feathers of the hummingbird become, and again, a way of use the hummingbird characteristics to name objects and things in other realms of nature, where we could call other realms of nature. So Huitzilopochtli, literally hummingbird stone. And lastly, we have various examples of Huitzilopochtli, hummingbird flowers or hummingbird plants. They abound in the Florentine Codex, plants that for one reason or another, either because they have flowers that hummingbirds feed from, or they're visited, or in the roots of hummingbirds, are named with reference to this animal. But let's get fully on the image that really became a puzzle that I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, and I think I have convincingly used to make this reconnection between hummingbirds and Huitzilopochtli. Here we have on the left a hummingbird on a nest. Then we have a hummingbird that is hanging from a tree. And this is a tree that is bare. It's a very different type of image. The hummingbird is colorless and motionless and shrunk. Then in the foreground, we have another hummingbird feeding from a red flower. And lastly, we have 4 hummingbirds on the wing on the right-hand side of the screen. I have argued that each of these different portrayals of hummingbirds are expressing a temporal quality to the image. And the way I started to realize that was by looking at the landscape itself, by looking at the earth, and by looking at the colors of the earth in this image. We know that in the Nahua world, there was a clear division of the seasons between a time called Xopan, literally the green season, which is a rainy season, and a time called Tonalco, named because of the tonali, or the shine of the sun, which is the dry season. Both seasons are associated with the different stages of development of corn. As we have heard already from Kali, corn is again the kind of the life source of these societies, and so everything goes back to the cycle of corn and how it grows and how it looks as it grows, including names for the seasons and for different stages of development. So what we would have here is a transition from Xopan, the rainy season, the green season, to Tonalco, and then again to Xopan, in the way the landscape is painted, first with a light green, then with a yellow layer, and lastly again with a green layer. Once I understood how to read the image temporally, seasonally, it became clear to me that the behaviors of hummingbirds could also be referring to some other form of spatial and chronological order. So then I decided to start connecting them, crossing them, juxtaposing them to the corpus of painted histories that we have. And this is what I came up with. So the first clue that there was something else happening beyond the kind of the time passing in the landscape was when I found this broken tree stump on the left side of the Florentine Codex Hummingbird entry. That tree stump really made me curious, because in this world, in this visual world, we know that nothing was casual. And the fact that this tree stump apparently was just part of the landscape, but not really doing much, made me think that it was doing some work that was just not being evident to us. Then I remember this image from the Boturini Codex, one of the 8 painted histories of the Mexica that we have, which portrays a scene in which a broken tree is an omen that says to the Mexica that they should separate from the tribes they're traveling with and continue the migration by themselves. This is a crucial moment in their history. This is when actually they are given their name by Huitzilopochtli himself. So in some ways, that is the beginning of their coming into being as a people, and it's signaled by this broken tree stump. So by looking at this scene, now with the logic of the painted histories, we see a very different key to understand what is going on in the hummingbird image beyond the seasons. Now we're dealing actually with Mexica history encoded into this entry. Another point for me was to see how we are having here depicted 2 hummingbird behaviors that are very contrasting. On the left-hand side, this dry hummingbird that is hanging from a tree stump is referring to the phenomenon of torpor. One of the most amazing characteristics of this animal is that it can go into this form of hibernation, short hibernation, where its temperature drops, its heartbeat drops, and it can basically show no life signs for a few hours, usually at night, or if it's suddenly caught in a cold spell or lacking food. This is an energy-saving mechanism that compensates for the very high metabolism of the hummingbird. And here, this image in juxtaposition with the very active hummingbirds we have on the right made me think of how in painted histories, Huitzilopochtli himself is also portrayed alternatively as a passive creature being carried around, as in the image you have on the top right, as a kind of bundle that is on the back of the mamas of the god carriers along the migration. And also, alternatively, it is presented as a fully attired, active warrior that is ready to act and defend the Mexica when needed. These very two contrasting characteristics of the hummingbird god are seen here in the Codex Azcatitlan, one next to the other, as they are in the Florentine Codex entry on the hummingbirds. Lastly, we also know that hummingbirds are tremendously voracious, and they have to be to keep up with that very fast metabolism. And here is where everything came together for me, really, was finding in the Florentine Codex, but not on the entry on hummingbirds, but several pages later in the same book 11 on the natural history, in the entry on hawks, on falcons, this image of Huitzilopochtli. This is, again, an image that has a text that is not translated into Spanish fully, and that depicts finally Huitzilopochtli as a human hummingbird hybrid that is receiving a heart from a falcon. This is the only instance in the whole Florentine Codex, in this whole encyclopedia, where we finally see Huitzilopochtli as a hummingbird god. And we see it also carrying the solar attributes of receiving a heart from a falcon, from a bird of prey. But we see this tremendous reconnection between the god and the animal that had been absent from the Florentine Codex at that point. So what have we learned? To me, this case is really fascinating because it shows us that in 16th century Mexico, the methodical study of nature by indigenous intellectuals gave an entirely new meaning to the term natural history. It no longer meant a compilation of facts about nature in the sense of historia, like in Pliny's Natural History or other Renaissance work, as it did in Europe at the time, but through the codification of historical episodes and seasonal cycles in visual form. The natural history of the Florentine Codex became the ultimate natural history. That is, it became a history where nature, in this case, an animal in the form of a tiny animal, was elevated to the status of protagonist in the history of a people. Thank you so much.
Wonderful presentation, Iris. That was absolutely fascinating. I never thought of these incredible connections about spatial-temporal manifestations of nature and the connections of Huitzilopochtli with hummingbirds. That's absolutely fascinating. We're going to be closing very soon, but before we do that, I want to read a question that was sent to Jessica. The question is that early in the lecture, you spoke of the tactility of labor. Can you speak about the use of sound and its relation to the materiality of process and objects filmed? So Jessica, question for you.
Thank you. Yeah, so the sound in the part of the, oh, I can hear myself. Oh, that's fine. The sound in the parts of the films that that you saw in the clips, that's one part of the film. It has two layers of sound to it, really. The first layer, I would say, is the Foley. So it was part of like this idea of embodying the conservator. I recreated the sounds through Foley. So I was sitting in a sound studio with objects that had similarity or not to what you're seeing, and recreating those sounds. So what you're hearing in a layer is that, and then there's also a layer of very manipulated sounds from a lot of locations where the materials of the objects came from. So it was kind of this idea. I worked with a sound designer called Philippe Champy, and we were kind of working around this idea of focusing on the materiality perhaps more than the artifact. So kind of the opposite of what museums do in a way, in general. So when you're looking at the ivory box and the restoration of the box, you're hearing sounds from Malawi, where one of the elephant tusks comes from. So yeah, that's kind of the sound space. And then I also tend to work a lot with close-ups, image-wise, and I tend to think of sound in a very similar way. Yeah, thank you.
Response, and we can see, I mean, at least I can begin to understand the nuanced relationships that are embedded into those strong connections there. There's a question for Callie as well, and the question for Callie is, thank you for your presentation. Can you speak to any case studies or people you draw inspiration from for your vision of BioJam?
Yes, oh my gosh, so many.
That's a nice question for you, Callie.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo, and whoever asked that question. So many. I think the major inspiration that we have is, I don't want to highlight particular groups per se, but just sitting down and talking with people and having space to have honest and vulnerable conversations. I think it's so important in doing this kind of work to have really authentic connections with everyone involved. And whether that's, going to someone's house and bringing them cookies, or asking about people's families, or going for walks after work and really building those relationships, that's how you can kind of create inspiration for the future. And so there's actually, as far as I'm aware, not a huge number of programs that are like ours. And so we're trying to imagine something new and also create inspiration from a lot of different places that have inspired us. So, so I don't have a lot of specific groups to point out. One thing that I would like to point out is Shinapa and the series of community biolabs that exist across the world. These are laboratories that anyone can go in and work in and create with. And so that idea of kind of decentralized biomaking that's centered in community is something that we take a lot of inspiration from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Callie. And Adam, do you have a question, comment that you want to share?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Rodolfo. I'll only just spend a moment or two, but I just wanted to reflect on, well, first of all, say how wonderful all the talks have been today, but Iris's talk was just, I found it sensational. And to me, I don't think you can get a better demonstration of, I mean, look, the two talks that both, that I did and Iris did, in terms of archaeological timescales, you're seeing people, Indigenous intellectuals, separated by tens of thousands of years doing much the same thing, telling stories about animals, telling stories about their connections with animals, seeing in animal behavior, oftentimes in the most, sometimes the most seemingly insignificant of animals, they're telling big stories and seeing, drawing inspiration from them. And also seeing, again, these therianthropes, this hummingbird god depicted as a hybrid human hummingbird. It's just incredible amongst the Mexica culture of recent centuries. Same thing happening 44,000 years ago. I just think that's just incredible. Absolutely amazing.
I thought the same when I saw your talk. I thought there was going to be a beautiful circularity to the session.
Yeah. If only we had those codexes from 44,000 years ago, how wonderful that would be. They're hard enough to figure out what's going on when you have the written text there. So you can imagine how difficult it is with the cave art.
Absolutely. It's the art of fragmentation.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that comment, Adam. Yeah, the therianthrope connection again sort of emerged in these beautiful presentations and illustrations and narratives that it is provided for us. Absolutely fascinating. In a very significant sense, Iris's presentation actually is a fantastic segue to the following element that we want to do before we close. So I want to bring this element, and then I will have a comment to wrap up. The strong connection that we see, having heard your fantastic presentation, the plan was to end up with a land acknowledgement, and I don't want to do my final comment before I do the land acknowledgement, because it connects so naturally and organically with what you presented, Iris. And so what I want to say is that although it has become a very common thing to just say something about land acknowledgements, I really want to say something about the land acknowledgement in the particular area that we're located at in this part of California, but in the sense that we really need to embrace and think carefully when we do these land acknowledgements beyond the simple recognition. With that spirit, I want to say that we are in California here, the three of us who organized this workshop. We are here in the land of the Muwekma Ohlone, and we respect, appreciate, and really admire the perseverance of this nation, of these people. And we at Stanford are so fortunate to have the land that they have maintained for us up until this day. And we recognize and appreciate the perseverance and the vivid presence up to this time, and we are very grateful to them. Unfortunately, as some of you imagine is the same or know is the same situation in other parts of the world, we still have many cases of unceded or taken land that has not been devolved or recognized as it should be for these indigenous people. Having said that, I want to close by saying I am delighted that Callie brought here the case of plants, and she mentioned two very interesting situations: the case of milpas, which again resonates so profoundly with Mexico and with Mesoamerica more generally, and in big contrast to, for example, the tremendously monocultural and industrialized agriculture that we see and suffer from today. Callie also mentioned the case of Chinampas, another fantastic way of living and connecting with nature in the case of plants. But the rest of the presentation were also fascinating from the zoocentric point of view, from the point of view of animals. So we started with animals really in my comment of Altamira, all the way down to the beautiful presentations that and examples that you provided, Iris. And I wanted to say that this is a clear manifestation of a long time ingrained connection with and psyche with animal life. We humans have a profound zoophilia that is so ingrained in our psyche, because of this strong connection with animals. Unfortunately, however, now we even have a word to describe what is happening to animal life. In this lab, where the three of us are, we work on a theme that we call defaunation, which is a term equivalent to the deforestation, to indicate that this beautiful legacy from archaic times is now being degraded. And we're terrified not only because of the loss of animal life and plant life, animal life, but also the loss and dilution of culture. And I really hope that a workshop like the one we have had today can bring reflection and can be an aspiration for us to do as much as we can to prevent the loss of the beautiful plant and animal life that we have in our planet, and also that we can prevent the loss and dilution of the beautiful cultural diversity that we still have in our planet. And I really thank you for bringing all of these elements to our presence and to our feeling and to our emotions in this wonderful workshop that you guys presented and shared with us. Thank you very, very much for all of these wonderful things that you shared with us. And thank you to the rest of the people who joined us today. And I hope they enjoyed, as we did, this fantastic workshop. Thank you very much again.